Good day to all our attendees so far. I hope that we will be joined by additional participants as we get going here. But because we're all super busy in the chemicals and waste arena, as you all are, I'd like to get started right on time. So my name is Marianne Bailey. I'm the Program Management Officer for Capacity Building and Technical Assistance here at the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. I'm joined here in the hosting duties by my colleagues Lynn Doan and Pablo Garmon. And I'm joined also by two colleagues from the Secretariat who will be presenters. Those are Richard Gutierrez and Manuela Pasua de Miranda. And we're joined also by a colleague from the UNEP Chemicals and Health Branch, Mel Gorzada Stilo. She's been very engaged in the ASGM National Action Plans and the knowledge management component thereof. And by Susan Keene, who is the Global Coordinator of the Planet Gold Program. So you'll hear more about those two efforts shortly. But first of all, I'd like to give you a little bit of information on why we're having this topic today. Minamata Online is the Secretariat's attempt to keep information fresh and at hand of all our parties and observers and other stakeholders, anyone who's interested in addressing mercury pollution. So we're now in season 3, and this is one of our seminars. All the Minamata Online recordings can be found on the Secretariat channel of YouTube, and they can also be found on our website along with the presentations. And you can find those by clicking on Minamata Online on our website or by searching the title of this presentation. So ASGM, why are we addressing ASGM? What is ASGM? I won't go into detail, but artisanal and small-scale gold mining is the sector that's responsible for the largest use of mercury globally, as well as the largest emissions of mercury to the environment and releases of mercury to land and water bodies globally. So it's always been a key topic within the Minamata Convention, was a key topic for negotiators of the convention who decided to take a really thought through approach to how to deal with an informal labor sector and how to deal with it effectively in a way that will really make a difference for the communities that are impacted by ASGM and for the countries and the globe writ large. So next, I'd like to just give you a brief overview of the topics we'll cover in the next slide. First of all, my colleague Richard Gutierrez will give you the basic requirements of Article 7, which is the article that addresses ASGM within the convention, and its Annex C. Then I'll give you some updates on various party notifications and submissions that we've had relevant to these Article 7 obligations. Then Manuela will talk about our intercessional work on Indigenous peoples, local communities, and ASGM. And then Gosha Malgarzada will give us insights from the NAP global component. And Susan will talk about how Planet Gold advances NAP implementation. We're all going to be fairly brief, so this won't be a 3-hour session. We'll be well within the hour, and we should have time for questions and answers afterwards. But do feel free to put any questions you might have in the chat at any time, and we'll try to address them at the end. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to turn right to Richard.
Thanks, Marianne. Good day and good day to everyone, and or good evening, wherever you may be. So I'm Richard Gutierrez. I'm a project management officer at the Secretariat, and I'm here to provide you an overview of what, as Marianne said, Article 7, which is the core article that governs ASGM under the convention. So the fundamental obligation on ASGM is established in paragraph 2 of Article 7. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in paragraph 2, it establishes as I mentioned, the fundamental obligation, and you can see that on the top part of the slide, which is that any party that has ASGM using mercury amalgamation in their territories are required to take steps to reduce and, where feasible, eliminate the use of mercury or mercury compounds from such mining and processing. So take note that the scope covers both mining and processing. Now, the second item that Article 7 provides is that if at any time the party determines that ASGM is more than insignificant in its territory, it needs to notify the Secretariat. And once once it's established that there is more than insignificant, as you may know, the term more than insignificant is not defined under the convention. So each party has the sovereignty to define and determine what is more than insignificant ASGM in its territory. But as I said, once that is established, the party has to develop, once it's established that it has more than insignificant ASGM in its territory, the party has to develop and implement a national action plan in accordance with Annex C, which I will be discussing very briefly in the next slide. But before I do so, I just wanted to call your attention that there is a guidance MC13 on the guidance on the development of a national action plan that is available. Now, once the national action plan is developed, the party needs to submit the NAP to the Secretariat no later than 3 years after the convention entered into force for it, or 3 years after the notification to the Secretariat, whichever is later. This is provided for in paragraph 3B of Article 7. And lastly, the item that I would like for you to take note of is that each party that has developed an app is required to provide a review every 3 years of the progress made in meeting its obligations under Article 7 and include such review in its national reports pursuant to Article 21. So that review process will be coming up soon, and I think Marianne will talk more about that in her presentation. I'll go on to the next slide, please, to quickly discuss on what the contents of Annex C is or are. So Annex C provides the contents, or at least the main points for the National Action Plan, in which it states that each National Action Plan shall include the following. You can see on the left side of the slide, the main points that need to be there: national objectives, list of practices to be eliminated, measures to formalize, baseline estimates and timetables, timetable for implementation of the National Action Plan. On the right side, you will see a set of strategies, which is elaborated in paragraphs I-E to J of Article 7, in which parties are also requested to include in their National Action Plan. So this runs the gamut from promoting reduction of emissions, managing trade, involvement of stakeholders, public health, preventing exposure to vulnerable populations, and providing information to minors and affected communities. On a side note, I'd like to call your attention as well. In developing these strategies, and if you're a national focal point listening in on this presentation, take note of Article 16, in which you can also elaborate the public health strategy you have taken under your NAP in your national report for Article 16. And then finally, on this slide, you have an optional strategies on the introduction of standards for mercury-free ASGM and market-based mechanisms or marketing tools. So these are optional items or strategies that you can include in your NAP once you developing your National Action Plan. Next slide, please. Just a quick shout out and note, we have guidance documents that's been developed with relation to the National Action Plan. To your right is the guidance document on the development of an app, which you can find on the convention website under the implementation tab. It's where the gold arrow is pointing. Another item that I'd like to call your attention to is that UNEP, in collaboration with the Secretariat as well as the Global Mercury Partnership, have developed a complementary technical document on the sound tailings management in ASGM. So I'll end my presentation there and hand over the microphone to Marianne. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. For our participants, that was a very speedy run through of Article 7 and Annex C. So please do, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. But I think the remaining presentations will clarify some of this for you. Because Article 7 is, it's kind of unique and kind of complex, but we really think it works well so far for our parties. So in the next slide, I think is just the cover page. And after that, so where are we with these notifications and submissions? So as Richard said, parties under Article 7.3, every time in every instance in which a party determines that ASGM using Mercury in its territory is more than insignificant, which we realize is a kind of difficult phrase, but that's the phrase that was determined by the negotiators of the convention to be useful and the most appropriate. So when the party determines ASGM using Mercury in its territory is more than insignificant, it notifies the Secretariat. The notification is a formal communication from the party government to the Secretariat. And we have these all posted on our website, as you can see in the graphic on the bottom of the slide. We do have our website in French and Spanish, as well as English, so you can click to determine which of those 3 languages you want to see this information in, but the notifications are there in the party tab. And so at this point, we have 42 parties that have notified the Secretariat that ASGM using Mercury in its territory is more than insignificant. We also have 7 non-parties that have notified of this. Now, it's kind of unusual for a convention to keep tabs on what non-parties are doing, but for us, this is very important to get at the big picture of how we're reducing global emissions and releases. And it's also important to that country because if the country is a signatory to the convention, even if it hasn't ratified and become a party yet, it may be able to access support under the Global Environment Facility for developing its National Action Plan, which is considered an enabling activity in our allocation at the Global Environment Facility. So that's why we're also keeping close track of non-parties who have notified under Article 7.3. And so what happens then? The notification date, as Richard said, triggers the deadline for submitting the NAP to the Secretariat. So it's 3 years after notification, or if that country was not a party at the time of notification, the deadline would be 3 years after the convention enters into force for that party. Next slide, please. So here's the status of submissions of national action plans. We're quite pleased that to date, we already have 24 parties that have submitted their national action plans to the Secretariat, as well as 3 non-parties. These are all published on our website, and you can see the tab. Again, it's the parties tab of our website under national action plans. We also are tracking both in national reporting and just by what has been submitted to us, those parties who are late vis-a-vis their submission deadline of the NAP. So we have 14 parties in that category, and we've reached out to them and we're working with them. It's not just that they're not doing the work. Many of these parties already already have completed national action plans that are being implemented, but for various reasons, they've faced delays in being formally submitted to the Secretariat. there's a few countries that for which their national action plan work hasn't commenced. So we're keeping a close eye on that, and I'll circle back to the big picture in a moment. In the next slide, this additional requirement in Article 7 is for those parties that submitted a national action plan to the Secretariat. They need to provide a review of the progress made, not only in implementing the NAP, but in implementing Article 7 as a whole. So these reviews are not particularly defined in the convention. There's no strict structure for these reviews or format or required elements. And to date, our parties are just now this year reaching the time based on the date of submission of their NAP when these reports should be, these reviews should be undertaken. So there's, I think about 8 to 10 parties for which they should be undertaking the reviews this year per the deadline. The results of their reviews are to be included in their national reporting under the convention, which is outlined in Article 21 of the convention. We have a 4-year cycle for full reports, full national reports under the convention. And we have a 2-year cycle for short national reports. So the short reports are 4 questions that the parties must answer, and there's a report of that nature due at the end of this year. So we're encouraging those parties whose reviews should have been undertaken by the end of this year to go ahead and submit the results of those reviews to us in their short reports, but if not, in their full national reports 2 years from now. And as I said, there's no mandatory required elements of these reviews. We have talked to several parties, and we find that they are also not quite sure of exactly what their review should look like, exactly what the elements of that should be, how they should get the data, etc. But these reviews are an opportunity for these parties to perhaps update their baselines, assess their progress toward their reduction targets, and even highlight implementation challenges. And the reviews could do other things that would not only provide us at the Secretariat and other parties and stakeholders with good information, but they would help the party assess how they're doing vis-a-vis Article 7 implementation, and perhaps get additional support towards any gaps. So we'll be looking more at those reviews and how parties can undertake them as the year goes on. In the next slide, I just want to summarize for you kind of the big picture of where we're at. So there's 42 party notifications under Article 7.3, 49 in all, counting non-parties. So what we want is for the NAP projects column and the NAP submissions column to eventually all meet that level of notifications. Eventually, they should all be in sync so that all the parties who have notified have a NAP, they're implementing their NAP, and they're eventually undertaking their reviews. And of course, we'd love the late NAP column to be down to 0. And as Susan will be talking about in a few moments, the Planet Gold projects are an important source of support for implementation of Article 7. So it's interesting to look at these, the number of countries involved in relation, all these columns in relation to one another. And then finally, I just want to recap for you in the next slide where on our website you can find these things. As Richard said, the implementation tab is where you can find the NAP guidance document, including its updates. And in the parties tab is where you can find the notifications and the NAPs. So with that, I think that's pretty much a summary of the status, and I'd like to turn to Manuela for an update on her work. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to you today. My presentation will be quite brief, but I'm available if you have questions afterwards or even after the event. So let me turn your attention now to a slightly different topic, and it's more on the most vulnerable populations that's to the effects of mercury pollution coming from artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And these are the indigenous peoples and local communities that live in or that work on the ASGM, or those that live around the ASGM sites, or even far away from ASGM sites. The work of the Minamata Secretariat with indigenous peoples and local communities started in earnest since the last COP, because that's when the parties took a decision requesting the Secretariat to collect the needs and priorities of indigenous peoples and local communities, and to prepare reports on how they are impacted by mercury pollution. One of the emerging this study is underway, by the way, and it's not yet ready, but it will be ready for COP5 at the end of October, beginning of November. The reason why indigenous peoples and the local communities are particularly vulnerable to the use of mercury in ASGM is because these peoples have a historic connection to the land where they live, and they depend very much on the natural resources that land and water provide. They traditionally live subsistence livelihoods, and they have a cultural and spiritual identity and connection to the land and water. They are also very important and crucial in addressing the crisis, environmental crisis related to biodiversity loss and climate change. For example, 80% of the remaining biodiversity around the world is located on indigenous lands. Also, they've been implementing nature-based solutions to mitigate climate change for centuries. So we have a lot to learn from those solutions as well. The study that we are conducting, one of the emerging conclusions is that the needs and priorities of indigenous peoples and local communities vary a lot. There is not one size fits all in terms of solution. And one of the reasons why they are so varied is because some of the communities are engaged in mining themselves, so they are the miners. Other communities are not engaged, but they are impacted by gold mining and the use of mercury. And those can be that the mining is happening on their lands, either with their consent or without their consent. And even some indigenous populations that are far away, for example, the Inuit in the Arctic, they are especially affected because they rely on fish and other food sources from the ocean and mercury, because of its transport characteristics, long range transport, accumulate in the high latitudes. So this is just to show that it's a complex question, and that the study that we are conducting is trying to unveil all these different nuances and the different needs and priorities. One thing that's common, though, among all indigenous peoples is the need to have their free, prior, and informed consent for activities related to artisanal and small-scale gold mining that may affect them. and that these, it's what we call FPIC, the free, prior, and informed consent, but that's a first step. Ideally, these operations would happen in partnership with the communities and with their continuous consent. So at the COP, last COP, the COP also requested or encouraged parties to engage in the indigenous peoples, local communities, and other relevant stakeholders in the development of their NAPs, as well as in the review of progress in implementing Article 7. So this is something that we will be following up at the next COP, COP 5. And one of the recommendations, a very clear recommendation, has already been that the guidance be developed, that the Secretariat supports the development of guidance on how indigenous peoples and local communities can be engaged and integrated into the process of developing maps, as well as reviewing progress. And if I could have the next slide, please. So as part of our efforts to engage and to integrate indigenous peoples in our work, we've created the Indigenous Peoples Platform of the Minamata Convention, which is still its young age, but we already have a number of people engaged. And the objective is to bring together the indigenous voices to promote their full and effective participation in the work of the Minamata Convention. We have different activities planned. For example, we will be running a pilot, a regional, at the margins of a regional preparatory meeting. We will be running, or at least we plan to run, a meeting that will target indigenous organizations and their representatives to prepare them for COP5. Next slide, please. Other efforts by the Secretariat involved with the publication of, issuing reports and publications that are relevant to indigenous peoples. One of these was released last week, is this a report on the socioeconomic impacts of mercury pollution on fisheries and livelihoods, with a focus on artisanal fisheries and the livelihoods of indigenous peoples and local communities who are very much dependent on small-scale fisheries. And of course, this has a strong link with ASGM because many of the ASGM sites happen near rivers that's the main source of fish that's eaten by the indigenous and local communities. One of the conclusions and take-home messages of this report is that mercury pollution disrupts crucial ecosystems, including food provision, air filtration, and water purification. This not only affects biodiversity, but also jeopardizes the economic livelihoods and well-being of millions, particularly of indigenous peoples and local communities. So I wanted to show this report here because it's directly relevant to ASGM, even though ASGM is not the main focus, but it's quite relevant, and there is a section on ASGM. Next slide, please. One other report that we are preparing and will be released very soon in time for COP5 is a technical document on in situ monitoring of mercury and mercury compounds in and around artisanal and small-scale gold mining sites. This does not focus on human health. It focuses on biota, wildlife, water, and sediments, basically. And it provides a step-by-step approach for those who wish to conduct conduct monitoring around the ASGM sites. It also has a strong focus on indigenous populations and local communities that live on the sites or around the sites, both those who are involved, but also those who are more affected by the mercury, and how to monitor those around their environment and how to integrate their knowledge into the monitoring activities. I think that was my last slide. If there are any questions, I'm available after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. It's really, really rich pictures here. I'd like to turn now to Gosha for insights from the NAP Global Component, which is funded by the Global Environment Facility. Go ahead, Gosha.
Thank you very much, Marianne. So as Marianne just outlined, I would like to provide you a little bit of insight from our work, where we looked on the Minamata National Action Plan and the wealth of information that the documents contain. Next slide, please. As we have heard at the beginning from Marianne, there are already over 40 NAP projects all over the world that you can see them here on the map. And out of these, 27 countries have submitted their national action plan. They are depicted in blue on this map. And next slide, please. So the development of the national action plan actually requires a good understanding of the ASGM sector in order to support the formulation of realistic and effective strategies and to measure then progress in its implementation of the Article 7. To gain this understanding, as we know well, countries first collect, just go back, yeah, thanks. Countries first collect the data from ASGM sites, visiting in the field, through stakeholder consultation and literature review. They collect data on mercury use and practices, mining practice employed at the site, as well as regulatory and policy framework, social, economic, health, and environmental aspects. Since NAP projects are relatively recent, the first one has been submitted in 2018, and many are still ongoing. The data collected through the NAP projects and in the documents reflect the most recent, in many cases, reflects the most recent information on the ASGM status in these countries. Next slide, please. So in order to assess the wealth of information gathered in the National Action Plan, we have reviewed the 27 documents that have been submitted to the Secretariat of Minamata Convention, and we have extracted quantitative and qualitative information and data and analyze it. So just to give you 3 examples of that, next slide, please. And what we can learn from the data that are featured in the NAP. So what we can see here, for example, we'll look on the mercury use estimates as reported by the 27 countries. And here we can see estimated quantities of mercury use in ASGM as reported by NAP document for 27 countries, and it's depicted in the purple bar. We have also overlapped this data with the previous estimates that are reported from the Global Mercury Assessment 2018, and these are the underlying dark gray bars. I wanted also to note that, as we can see, our first country that is on the list, the estimates are much higher of mercury use in the sector are much higher than for the other 26 countries. So it would go beyond the scale of this x-axis. For Indonesia, it's 345 tons of mercury use per year, as reported in their NAP document, whereas the 26 countries, the x-axis that you can see is in proportion to the bars. So as we can see here, in about half of the cases, the NAP data indicates a significant increase in the estimated amount of mercury use in contrast to previous estimates from Global Mercury Assessment. For example, in case of Madagascar or Burundi, estimates from NAP increased by over 10-folds. In other cases, for example, in Ecuador, DRC, Mongolia, the NAP estimates are lower than previously reported amounts. So this finding does not necessarily mean that mercury use change during this time, over this time, but might also reflect in part the availability of new information collected through the nationwide field study undertaken by the NAP project. Next slide, please. My second example is about occurrence of the worst practices that are mentioned in Annex C of the Minamata Convention, that the parties are required to set strategies to eliminate those worst practices. And if we look now on the data from 27 countries that submitted their NAP, the most common worst practice, as reported by 24 out of 27 countries, is still open burning of amalgam. Most of the countries, 19 of them, as well reported burning of amalgam in residential areas, which still puts minors and families, the surrounding communities, in a danger of direct exposure to mercury. The least common worst practice, as reported by the 27 countries, is a whole or amalgamation. Its presence was reported in half of the countries, in 14 countries. Some of the countries, actually, for example, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Mali, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Senegal, explicitly reported absence of the whole or amalgamation within their territories. So this might indicate perhaps a shift, the one that we want to see towards less mercury-intensive operation, but it might also indicate the likelihood that the whole or amalgamation might have never been practiced in those countries in the first place. So there, again, as ASGM sector is so diverse, there will be also diverse explanation for the data presented here. And the next slide, please. My third example is about the intention of countries to reduce mercury. So the key element that we are looking on also in the implementation of the Minamata Convention. So mercury reduction targets, as outlined in the NAP documents, provide an indication of when and how much mercury can be avoided in the ASGM in the countries. So here what we can look at the beginning for the baseline for the 2020-2021, as reported, it's a cumulative baseline amount as reported by 27 countries. It's over 750 tons per year for these 27 countries. And by 2025, 65% of that amount, almost 500 tons, is targeted to be eliminated if the country are to implement the strategies and activities outlined in their national action plans. By 2030, over 600 tons of mercury, 81% of the baseline amount, is targeted to be eliminated by the countries. So as Marianne mentioned, with more NAP being submitted, with NAP reviews as well being submitted and reported, we will have a better global picture of the latest trends in the ASGM sector in these countries and the efforts to reduce mercury. Next slide, please. And I would also invite you to visit Global Mercury Partnership website, where we host interactive dashboards that gather all the qualitative and quantitative information that we extracted from the NAP documents. This includes, as I just demonstrated, various quantitative information on mercury use or reduction, but as well look into narrative information like role of women, impacts on biodiversity, health aspects of community, and then as well summarizes key strategies outlined by each NAP document. So I will the link will be also available through the presentation, and maybe can put also in the chat if you would like to explore further this wealth of information gathered in the NAP documents. And thank you very much for your attention. Please do not hesitate to follow up if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Gosha. And thank you also to your colleagues. You all have put in great effort to make this interactive dashboard available to all interested parties, stakeholders, observers, everyone. So it's really a great tool. Let's move on now to Susan Keene, the global coordinator of the Planet Gold program, and she'll give you an explanation of what is Planet Gold and how it relates to NAP implementation.
Great.
Go ahead, Susan.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Marianne. Yeah, so hi, everyone. As Marianne said, I'm Susan Keene. I act as the global coordinator for the overall Planet Gold program. So thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to attend this event. So I'm going to give a very high level overview of the Planet Gold program and how it supports the implementation of NAPS, and then invite you to explore the program further through our website. So next slide, please. So the Planet Gold program is funded by the Global Environment Facility as a financial mechanism of the convention, and it is meant to assist parties to meet their obligations under Article 7 of the Minamata Convention. So phase 1 of Planet Gold started with 9 countries in 2018. And a second phase that just started this year added 14 additional countries, some of which have already started implementation and others of which will begin full implementation in the coming months. So on this map, the gold colored countries are the phase 1 projects, which are wrapping up actually now, and then the blue are the new countries that are coming on board. But I want to note that Planet Gold isn't just meant to serve the needs of these particular parties. In fact, it's also supposed to serve as a knowledge platform to collect and disseminate evidence and information, lessons learned from these projects and from the global experience, and to enhance communication about ASGM for all parties who have an obligation under the convention to reduce mercury use in the sector. Next slide, please. So the Planet Gold program's mission is to make small-scale gold mining safer, cleaner, and more profitable, and mercury-free, if possible, with the vision of having a clean global supply of gold from small-scale miners. And as a program that supports the Minamata Convention, obviously we have a very ambitious mercury reduction target as our main objective. But to accomplish this objective, each country project in the program has a similar set of components that are listed here in the light green sections. So that's to help formalization of the sector, to introduce mercury-free technologies and other improved technologies, to remove barriers to formal finance, and to create access to formal gold supply chains, which will encourage miners to adopt mercury-free methods and improve their livelihoods. And then outreach and knowledge management and communication awareness raising really underpins all of the activities of the program. Next slide, please. So it's not a coincidence that the design of the Planet Gold program and its main components are also key elements that are required to be addressed in the NAPS, as Richard reviewed at the beginning of this session. These elements match requirements under Annex C of the convention. So the element on advancing formalization matches the requirement in paragraph 1C. Access to finance and formal markets really responds to the ability of parties to use market mechanisms to reduce mercury in their sector. The uptake of mercury-free technologies addresses both the elimination of worst practices as well as the introduction of reduced mercury methods. And then even the communications and knowledge sharing element also addresses paragraph 1J, which calls on parties to develop strategies for sharing information. So this is all Planet Gold country projects have the same structure. And then we are also serve as a global coordinating component that makes sure that all of the countries work together to share their advances and information as they work through the program on assisting their overall goals of achieving their NAP reduction, mercury reduction targets. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the major roles of the global project, which I run, is to promote knowledge sharing and communications. And so we do this in 2 directions. So for the past few years at the beginning of the program, what we've done is, next slide please, is we've combed through the literature, the entire, global literature on the relevant issues of finance, access to finance, formalization, and mercury-free technologies, and created a massive database, which you can find on the Planet Gold website. I think we have over 600 relevant materials in that database right now. But that's a lot. So we've also curated those materials and combed through them to find the most important key documents, project descriptions, tools, etc. So there's a curated collections section. Parties can go and look at what are the highlights of the literature and the most salient, important information on those issues. And finally, where we found gaps, we also have created some case studies and best practice documents to try to fill in those gaps, and those are also available on the website. But importantly, now that we're kind of coming to the end of, almost to the end of phase 1, our job is now really to harvest and collect all of the experience from the Planet Gold country projects and make sure that those lessons learned are brought before and disseminated to the global community. So now we're at this point, we're really focusing on trying to document the results and successes and also the challenges of the program so that we can contribute to that evidence base, and that will assist all parties when they're trying to develop very effective strategies for implementing their NAPs. Next slide, please. I did want to just give a plug for the Planet Gold website, planetgold.org. This is where the resource library that I mentioned is housed. And so you can go and explore. There's lots of different tools to help you explore it. It's in multiple languages. And I encourage everyone to go and have a look at that. The Planet Gold website also has individual country pages for every Planet Gold country, so you can look at specifically what's going on in particular countries and their products and materials. And there's also, of course, lots of other information. There's blogs, news, event pages, contact information, just lots of other resources and materials really meant for any country who, or really anyone in the world who needs evidence and information that will help them develop and implement strategies under the NAP. Next slide. So if you have any questions about the Planet Gold program, you can contact me at this email address. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Susan. Really clear, and we've all been very brief. So to our participants, we do have enough time for questions. If you have any, you can go ahead and just raise your hand if you do. And I don't see any questions in the chat, but feel free to put them there as well. And again, these all these presentations, as well as the recording, will be available from our website, the mercuryconvention.org, and the Minamata Convention YouTube channel will have the recording. Now, what else do I want to say about this? So because ASGM is, as I said earlier, such an central topic within the Minamata Convention, all the other articles of the convention also are at least intended to reinforce the work that our parties are undertaking towards reducing and eliminating mercury use in ASGM. So as an example of that is the provisions on the trade of elemental mercury, which is really now under a prior informed consent regime under the convention's Article 3. There are also provisions on storage, for example, if mercury is seized from a mining site, waste management, and estimation of stocks, and even the really important provisions on dental amalgam, because very early on in the negotiations towards the convention, it was learned that a lot of mercury in trade is diverted from allowed uses to ASGM without the the country's knowledge or consent because it is imported perhaps as dental amalgam or for other uses. So all these elements of the convention are intended to work together so that the work on ASGM reinforces some of the other articles, and the other articles also reinforce the work on ASGM. And this is going to be discussed at our 5th Conference of the Parties, which starts on October 30th of this year. We will have a meeting document on ASGM, and we will also have at least 2 information documents which capture a lot of the information that you've heard today. So let's see, do we see if there are any hands? I'm not sure if we can. Okay, I don't see any hands, which is fine. That means we've been very clear and thorough, I hope. But feel free to contact any of us. And as all of us said, you can find more information on our website, on the interactive Tableau dashboard that the NAP Global Component has developed, and in the Planet Gold treasury of resource information, documents, guides, case studies, etc. And we do need to thank the Global Environment Facility and its donors for their very strong support of all the work on ASGM, including the development of the National Action Plans and the Planet Gold program.
Marianne, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So given all of this experience with preparing and developing NAPs, and in some cases implementing NAPs, has there been any discussion among parties that you've heard in your role as a secretariat about updating the guidance on developing NAPs, or perhaps even developing ancillary guidance on how to do the reporting? Like more structured guidance? Has that, because I just remember that, that guidance was written so long ago, really before a single NAP was written. So there's, might be time to think about, but I don't know if there's any push from parties to do that.
We have heard interest from parties, especially in terms of these reviews that they need to undertake, and even just the idea of doing these reviews needs a little bit more attention so that all the NAP parties know that they need to do them. But it's come up in that context. Of course, at COP4, the public health strategies for NAPs, those elements of the NAP guidance was agreed by the Conference of the Parties. Those were developed by WHO. There's also the tailings guidance, and I might be forgetting some elements that were discussed at COP4. So there is certainly interest in all these tools, and in particular the guidance being, I guess, being able to evolve over time and continuing to meet the needs that they were designed for. So I predict there will be more of that discussion at COP5, and it is an active interest topic of the parties. But in terms of specific requests for updating the guidance or changing it in any way, I haven't heard that. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to weigh in, or Gosha or anyone else.
If I may, Marianne, and thanks, Susan, for this question. It's not yet clear what the COP and the parties of the Minamata Convention will do at COP5. But one of the emerging conclusions of the study that we are undertaking on the needs and priorities of indigenous peoples and local communities is the need for additional guidance, perhaps supplementary guidance, on the development of NAPs, particularly focusing on the engagement of indigenous peoples and local communities in a way that happens hand in hand with their cultural beliefs and perspectives. So we don't know, again, we don't know how these will, how the deliberations at COP5 will take place. But this is something that's going as part of the recommendations from this study.
Thanks, Manuel. And that was in response to a decision the parties took at COP4 to undertake this particular focused work that Manuela and others have been working on since COP4.
Marianne, I also want to jump in terms of the not on the updating of guidance, just as sort of an observation from the national reports that were submitted, particularly in question 7.4, which asks parties if they conducted a review of the implementation of the provision. What we've seen is that parties are, when it comes to question 7.4 of the national reports, parties have been resubmitting their national action plan, thinking that there is that by submitting the national action plan, it acts as a review. I think we've had 4 parties do this, and I think at COP5 this issue will come up again. For sure, and definitely from what we're seeing at the national report level is that improved clarity is needed, and I think parties may, without prejudging or what the parties would say, definitely at least in terms of the experience from the national report side, there's lack of clarity on how to proceed with the review, and I think parties will be recognizing this issue at COP5. Thanks. Back to you.
Thanks,
Yes.
Richard. Really good point.
Thank you. I can just maybe 1-2 sentences. So also based on our experience in the last 2 months, we have been actually consulting with the countries in West and East Africa for regional workshop that focus on the NAP development and implementation. And we have heard from many of the countries that they would welcome some additional guidance, as was noted already. Most of them also acknowledge that they would like to, into some level, review their baseline information, what you, Marianne, mentioned also at the beginning, because as we know, ASGM sector can transform very quickly, also depending on the local circumstances. So they mentioned a lot of important elements that they would like to include in their NAP review. And I think maybe also important element was that several countries were also looking for the clarification whether they need to submit their review even if they did not do any progress. So I think this is also something maybe to clarify for the Secretariat. Thank you.
That's quite an enlightening question. And we do take every opportunity when we talk about NAPs to say that the NAPs not only need to be submitted, but they need to be implemented. That's a requirement of the convention. So we're always reminding our parties, don't just write it and put it on a shelf. You gotta take every effort to fully implement it.
Marianne, I'm sorry, but to interrupt, but I received a question through email. I guess the person's chat wasn't working. Should I go ahead and read it?
Yes, please.
So it's from an LLM student, and they're in an indigenous territory in Brazil at the moment where alarming levels of mercury have been found among adults and children. And as a signatory of the Minamata Convention, Brazil doesn't any longer officially import much mercury, yet it's widely available in the Amazon from where she writes. And so it's well known that Bolivia is a major buyer from Mexico, for example, and then it enters Brazil. So only last week, 300 kilos from Bolivia was found here. What can be done to address this through the terms of the convention? So I thought you had spoken about the trade materials before, so I thought I'd make sure that you got that question.
Thank you. I'll just answer very briefly and then see if others want to chime in. There is a global environment facility on mercury trade in Latin America. It's a regional multi-country project. that was approved, I think it was late last year. So it is beginning implementation. So that is one way to address this issue so that the trade flows are not only better understood, but better controlled. Do others have anything?
Yeah, just maybe to add, think Marianne. So Brazil is also actually last year have started their NAP for the ASGM project. So they are undertaking, now efforts to develop the national action plan for the sector. And they are, as we speak, they're actually now in the field, collecting more information, learning more, understanding better the local circumstances. And so I think that is also opportunity to maybe connect with the project in Brazil. They have actually very nice knowledge platform as well, Oro Sim Mercurio. Maybe we can also put a link here that is really talks about their national efforts to manage Mercury from the ASGM sector. Thank you.
If I may also add, this is another area that our study has revealed that's quite important for some of the indigenous communities, which is to, in particular, those that are not involved directly with the mining, that they would like to see more enforcement of, in terms of trade of elemental mercury, and particularly more enforcement to ensure that illegal mining, illegal trade of mercury in accordance with national laws is enforced. So this is one of the areas that we may recommend as well to the COP to have closer look. And I also wanted to highlight that we are planning a regional meeting with indigenous peoples in the Amazon region, exactly to look into that into more detail and to be able to further understand their needs and priorities in this regard.
Thanks to
Marianne,
all of you.
Marianne, if I may add just
Yes,
one
please.
quick item. In terms of, again, looking at the national report, one of the things that sort of is sort of bubbling on the issue of trade, at least, is the lack of clarity on which is an allowed use and which is not an allowed use. And this tends to contribute to trade that's not recognized under the convention. So this is something, again, that needs to be looked at, and also to dispel misconceptions of what is an allowed and what's not an allowed use. And part of the challenges that we're seeing as well is that the determination of an allowed use is at the national level. And sometimes it's not clear from exporting or particularly from exporting or importing parties if such use is allowed under the domestic law of a particular party. So just a tidbit of information there that might prove useful in understanding more non-compliant trade under the convention, or non-compliant trade. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And just in case anyone, I think some people are unable to use the chat function. So let me just give a couple of minutes right now, just open floor. I don't know if participants are able to unmute yourselves if you want to ask anything, but also feel free to email any of us. We'd be happy to answer questions at a later time. Any questions from the floor? Okay, well, we've just gone a couple of minutes over our allotted time. So thank you so much to all our presenters. Thank you to all our participants. If please do email us, any of us, at any time if you'd like more information on the Minamata Convention requirements or on the work that is underway to address those requirements. With that, have a great day or evening and hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.